All right. So I'm Rob Kaufman. My pronouns are he, him. And today I'm going to be talking about Knapsack, which is an approach to Haiku development that we've been working on at SoftServe. So this talk comes to you in three acts. What is Knapsack? Why is Knapsack? And how is Knapsack? So first we'll talk about what Knapsack is. In Hyrax and Haiku, we generally have um, an architecture where there's lots of small components that can come together to make up what you might think of as the Hyrax core. And then there's additional components that are sort of built on top, either Haiku or maybe your own app that's built on Hyrax. There's also apps like Avalon and maybe your custom Hydra app that use those same core components. I think that there are two common pieces of terminology for this kind of architecture, depending on how you feel about it. Some people might refer to it as a bag of bees architecture. And in a more favorable note, you might think of it as like a Voltron architecture where everything's coming together. With Knapsack, we're inverting that a little bit, and we're saying that you should essentially have a thin layer of customizations on top of the stack. This plugin architecture is much more common out there in the wild for some pretty good reasons. Typically, a expandable application stack like ours would be built so that you have a solid fundamental core, and then you have plugins on top of it. Think WordPress or Spree. The Shopify underlying architecture is built this way. Many of the platforms out there, both Jira and Confluence, are built like this, have that sort of structure. And so with Knapsack, we're kind of bringing that to Samvera land. It doesn't do anything necessarily about the core components or Hyrax at this point, but it does say, hey, let's put our custom code up at the very top, and then we can consider whether we can consolidate some of these core components down into Hyrax. There's been some talk of what a Hyrax Haiku merger would look like way down the road. I'm not asking for that today at all, but mostly just giving us some options and keeping us. I think it provides for a few considerable benefits. The first benefit is it makes upgrading a lot easier. If your custom code is all in a very top layer, you can see which things you've overridden, you can read the release notes, and you can easily tell which things need to be changed in your app in order to take advantage of the existing app. The second thing is it means that the path of least resistance for developers is to put things into Haiku or Hyrax or the core components. This driving towards making the easiest thing you could do to be to contribute back the feature that you're working on, and to bring us to a contribute first setup instead of a contribute last setup helps us solve a really important problem. I think we've all been frustrated to see some feature we desperately want in someone's custom repository that hasn't been contributed back. And the reality is no one's doing that maliciously, or at least maybe very few people are doing that maliciously. Mostly what happens is, like all software projects, your project is running a little behind. It takes longer to build than you wanted it to. And if contributing back is the last step, if it's a hard step, if there's friction there, it's just the thing that gets cut because you had to go live. And so ultimately, this architecture, one of its big goals is it's easier to put something in Haiku or Hyrax than it is to put it in the knapsack. That doesn't mean we're adding additional friction. It doesn't mean you have to wait for it to be reviewed by the community and merged. It means you can start a PR, keep that with your code, continue to deploy, move forward, and eventually update to the latest release. And then the last thing is, because the customizations are all sort of attached at a higher level, sharing them should be a lot easier. The thing about a plugin architecture that's really allowed it to flourish in the wild in other projects is the sharing of those customizations. And then eventually, in some projects, the building of ecosystems around them, right? There are folks whose entire livelihood is making either Jira or WordPress plugins. And so like that, ability to have an ecosystem, I think, is actually benefits it being sort of the last piece instead of one of the lower down pieces. We want features in Haiku. If the change you want to make is generally applicable, I'm happy to work with you to get it merged into Hyku and released. And I'm speaking here as the current product owner for Hyku. And I think that, in our discussions of expanding that role over time, I think that's going to stay a core concern of that role. It is super valuable for Hyku to be the place that has sort of a broad set of core functionality. We don't need to do a lot of work to like trim and trim and trim there. What goes into hierarchs, we can be a little more cautious about and be a little more, need to be a little more proven. But if the thing you're building doesn't hurt anybody else, we're going to put it in. If it's commonly applicable, but not universally applicable, we'll put it behind a feature flag. And again, I'm really happy to work with folks to get their stuff merged in so that it is part of Hyku and gets upgraded when Hyku gets upgraded. If you think something might be half-baked or need refining, we'll still work with you to get it merged into Hyku. Maybe it goes behind a feature flag with an experimental warning. Maybe it gets dark deployed for a little while you continue to work on it. Like, don't feel like you have to come with only fully completed ideas or features. We can work from the get-go in PRs to make things work. And having the Knapsack architecture is going to allow us to do that. So if we're saying push everything into Hyku, then what goes into your Knapsack? Really, the things that go into your Knapsack are your custom theme. So customizations to the views is often a place where our app diverges the most from other apps that are out there. Your deployment info. Are you deploying to Heroku? Do you have a Helm chart? Do you have customizations for your Helm chart? Do you have other things that are about your deployment? Are you a Sentry shop or a Honey Badger shop? How do you do your error tracking? That might be something that's part of your deployment process and therefore should be in your Knapsack. And then lastly, custom work types. And custom work types get the footnote because we are working to merge an Allison Flex-like YAML-based interface for defining work types into Hyku in the near future, at which point you won't necessarily need to store your custom work types this way. You would store them as YAML files. So ultimately, that last bullet point's going away, but at the moment, custom work types are really the third thing that go in your Knapsack. Now, again, if you have something that's just super crazy unique to you and no one else is ever going to want, that uses some proprietary on-campus only system, I can understand. Again, you can put that code in your Knapsack just fine. It'll work there, no problem. So if you are starting a new Hyku application today, I would, instead of going and just downloading Hyku, download the Hyku Knapsack. It's here in Samvera Labs. It's looking for adopters. And essentially what this does is it is a engine that fundamentally, I'm getting ahead of myself. Basically, it's an engine that plugs into the Hyku application, but it's sort of set up specifically to kind of be on top. If you already have a Hyku application, the link in the README here in that Hyku Knapsack repository gives you a lot of guidance on how to do this. The big task fundamentally is separating any custom code you have that's entangled with the Hyku code base. That part is painful, but that part is painful every time you upgrade your application. So paying that pain one more time or one time is much better than paying for it over and over and over again. So knowing it's the last time can make that a little bit easier pill to swallow. And once you have your stuff extracted out into the Knapsack, it's much easier to maintain. Code in the Knapsack overrides code in Hyku. And so essentially, generally with Rails engines, you would, and like Hyrox is a Rails engine, Blacklight is a Rails engine, you would bring in the engine and then put your application code on top of it. Well, Hyku is the application. And so there's some work in the Hyku Knapsack to allow it to override and be sort of the last in the line of items. So for example, with view files, typically an engine injects itself lower than the application, so that if you write a view and the view exists both in the application and in your engine, that the one in the application takes precedence. In Knapsack, that's inverted, and so the one in the Knapsack takes precedence over the one that is in Hyku. Having said that, because we are overriding some functionality for doing things like custom theming or possibly a proprietary feature, then what we would do in order to do that is we use this decorator pattern. It's not the decorator pattern from the book of object-oriented patterns, unfortunately. These overrides are called underscore decorator simply because that is a common Rails convention. Both Spree and Refinery, which are very large Rails projects with lots of momentum, use this underscore decorator for their way of doing this. And so we use the same fundamental pattern just to be consistent across Rails applications where we can. The fundamental thing is you can just replace the method or two methods that you need to. You don't need to always override the entire function with this pattern. And so it allows you to really zero in on the part that's custom, which means the chances of needing to change it or being broken by an upgrade go down. Every line of code that you override becomes a line you have to maintain, and you want to maintain as few of them as possible. There's more details on how to use the decorators in the knapsack. So like how to do the module prepend and all of that stuff is in the knapsack documentation. We also at SoftServe as a convention, no matter how we're overriding a file, use these override statements. And so we specifically put a comment at the top of the file that says override. It goes right under the frozen string literal true statement in a Ruby file. We say what gem we're overriding, and then we say what version we've last checked it at. This isn't what version we overrode originally. This is the version it was last confirmed at. And then some comment that is better than fix some busted stuff. Ideally, it's a very specific comment about what you're trying to accomplish in this file. It's not what you wrote in this file. It's what was the goal, the why did you override. These code comments are gold. Fundamentally, when you are upgrading, being able to find all of the files that override hierarchs and see when they were last checked against hierarchs is really, really beneficial. At SoftServe, when we are doing an upgrade, what we do is we go find all these comments, and even if the file, say we're upgrading from hierarchs 3 to hierarchs 5, if the file hasn't changed, we would change the code comment anyway to say override hierarchs version 5.0.1, and then you can probably leave the description alone. These comments will sometimes be multi-line, so they'll say override hierarchs and then the version, and there'll be like 4 or 5 lines of things below that are the reasons for the override. But by keeping those reasons around, it helps bring back context to developers as to why does this file exist. Maybe it's to fix an issue, and it points to a hierarchs issue with the GitHub link. And you go click on that issue when you're doing the upgrade, and you see, oh, that's been fixed and merged. So now we can just delete this whole file, and we don't have to do anything about upgrading it. So this has saved a tremendous amount of time. And then lastly, I just want to reiterate with everyone, like fundamentally, like this pattern is not something that we made up. We took work that Chris Kolivar had done as part of Ubiquity Press and sort of codified it into a more generic template. So I don't want anyone to ever think that I'm trying to take credit for this idea fundamentally. This is standing on the shoulders of giants to build something a little bit better and to try and put some work against what is a very common problem that we've run into over and over again, which is difficulty in upgrading and issues with code not getting contributed back. So those are our goals here, and this is kind of what we've done to make that happen. I seem to have a lot of extra time. I have a couple minutes. So I'm happy to do questions at this point.